Hello and welcome to Historical Fiction with Kviatoslav. In this video, I'll be discussing one of my favorite authors, Harold Lamb, and his short stories here in this collection from Swords from the West, which is one of my favorite collections of short stories. And I'll be doing this video in concert with my new friend, Derek Green, who has a great YouTube channel dedicated to historical fiction, and he and I have agreed to read the first three stories from this collection and basically give our thoughts and make videos kind of independent of each other. I'm not sure if he's read these stories before. I have read them before, but I'm definitely not for a while, so I've read them recently. To get another opinion on them, and I'm looking forward to seeing his video as well and hearing about his insights onto these stories, which I enjoy quite a bit. And I'll also use this as an opportunity to discuss short stories in general and why I think historical fiction works well in this format and why I think it's a bit of a lost art there. I'll start with that. In general, I think short stories are really a great way to introduce people to historical fiction, in that you can cover many more eras and many more time frames with short stories. A big advantage to short stories, for example, when you read a novel, many times you can get a bit lost in the novel, or if you're like me, you don't have a lot of time to immerse yourself into the novel, which I think with historical fiction you really need that immersion. And if you don't have a lot of time, sometimes it's difficult to immerse yourself in a novel. Whereas a short story you can often read in a single sitting. Many of these stories in this are 15, 16 pages. So they tend to go very quickly, and you can read them in a single sitting and kind of absorb yourself there, but not feel like you have to constantly start and stop with the plot and so on, like as you would with a novel. And I think one of my favorite things to do with these stories is I really enjoy when I start off the story and I get to look for some context clues for kind of a setting and a time period and so on there. One of the things I've done with all of these stories is I tried to use clues. Sometimes they actually come out and say exactly the year when it happens. Use clues to try to place what year roughly I think it is based on the characters or based on the setting and so on there. So it's one of the things I enjoy. So with that in mind, there will be a few spoilers with regards to this, because obviously it's difficult to discuss the the story and the setting and the plot without talking a bit about the year, the date, and the time, and the setting, the area there. So the three stories that Derek and I agreed to discuss initially are the first three that occur in this collection, which was assembled by Howard Andrew Jones there, and who, when he was first putting these out, the late Mr. Jones, I had a bit of correspondence with him, and I remember one of the questions I asked him was, what was his line of reasoning with the order of the stories, because it felt a bit random here that the stories did not occur in kind of publication order or chronologically according to the time period there. And he gave me, I think, a very reasonable answer, in that he just used a kind of a personal, he tried to split up the stories in terms of pacing, some short stories and long stories to split themselves up, and stories which seemed similarly related, he tried to kind of space out a bit there, which is, I think, a perfectly good way to space out these stories. There's a very nice foreword in this one, which gives some background on Howard Andrew Jones and his life and so on there, which is an interesting read. And the first, there's an introduction to one of the stories there, but the first story in this collection is called The Red Cock Crows, which isn't that difficult to identify when it takes place, because basically it reads that it takes place in 1402. And if you know anything about Harold Lamb, that is the time of one of his favorite historical personages, Tamerlane, or Timur the Lame there, who is referenced in this story. He doesn't actually make an appearance in this particular story there, but it is his presence looms large. And this story starts out, it concerns a Western knight, a Scotsman named Sir Bruce, who is traveling in Asia Minor. The city it's set in is called Tana, which is would have been part of the uh, around the outskirts of the Byzantine Empire at that time. And I just wanted to give you, I might read a few passages here just to give you kind of a sense of the prose for for Harold Lamb, excuse me, because he's got quite a nice style. You know, these stories are about 100 years old at this point, but they're still very readable for the modern reader. In that they managed to be the prose managed to be very strong and poetic, but also very accessible there, and very literate in that you will probably learn some new words, or at least be exposed to words you don't normally use, but they tend to be archaic words, and I think that goes a long way toward setting the scene with historical fiction there. So I'll just read a small section here from this from the beginning of this story. Pickoff went warily, turning the corners wide, with his ear cocked to the bickering and brawling that went on, only half seen. It was the hour, he had said more than once, when the horned one held the open market. Pickoff himself was a Lombard Redbeard, with a knack of stabbing and a nice touch for stealing. He served Messer Andrea, the master of the slave brokers, and he held himself to be better than the masterless rogues, the rebels of the alley, such rogues as he now paused to watch. So there's a very kind of poetic quality to it, in that it really intrigues you. But not only can he do that, but he can actually write some interesting action as well. Within the first 3 pages, we get a nice bit of swordplay here, which I'll just note as well. So. Let's see. His comrades pressed in closer then, and Pickoff saw that for which he had been looking. Behind the blind beggar appeared a stout Levantine boatsman, grasping a short axe, watching his chance to strike. The thieves clamored louder, and the boatman shifted his weight to his left foot, and the corners of his lips twitched in a snarl. Suddenly he struck, full at his victim's eyes. But the tall man had caught the flicker of steel in the light of the lantern. His right arm shot forward, thrusting the blind beggar back, and he himself bent back for the hips. The boatsman's axe swung harmlessly through the air. At the same instant, the stranger pulled clear his sword. The point of the long blade swept out and down. The boatman shrieked. The sword's edge caught his wrist and cut through it. The axe, still gripped in hairy fingers, dropped to the earth. So, so it's not quite as kind of visceral as Robert E. Howard there, but it does carry a bit of action there. And I said I won't go into too much detail in this story, but like many of Harold Lamb's stories, it contains some treachery and some backstabbing and some excitement there. And another great thing about his stories is he's very balanced in that even though this one concerns protagonists from Swords from the West, you can find heroes and villains on both sides of the cultural divides there. The say Saracens or Muslims are not always the foes. The Christians are not always the heroes or the villains, and you'll find good on both sides. So his writing is very balanced there. The second story that we are discussing is called The Golden Horde here. And this one, from context clues, is set a bit earlier. I think I placed it at about, what was it there? So 1292 from a few context clues. This is the longest of the 3 stories that we've agreed, and quite a good one. This has one of the few reoccurring characters here, in that the main character in this one is a knight called Niall O'Gordon there, who's an interesting character because he's one of these, he was what was called a Putin, or basically a European who was born in Outremer, in the Holy Land, the Kingdom of Jerusalem at that time. So even though he was a kind of a European knight, he grew up entirely in what now would be the Israeli lands there, and basically would grow up speaking Arabic and with a very kind of Eastern philosophy there. And the setting of this one is right at the end of the kingdom of Jerusalem, when at the final fall of Acre there, and or Aker, and this knight, Niles O'Gordon, who's a really interesting guy, finds himself basically landless and homeless there. And unlike a lot of his fellow kind of extracted Europeans who went back, or didn't actually necessarily go back to Europe because many of them had never been there before, but back culturally to Europe, he actually struck out to the east and actually winds up in Tana, the same city which was mentioned in the earlier story. However, this one's set about 150 years earlier there. And this one is a bit more complex. We've got quite a bit more backstabbing there, and a complex plot which involves the very honest Niall, who's constantly trying to be tricked, but we find out that he is not quite as naive as he seems to be there. And again, I won't go into further spoils than that, but it's got some great characters, particularly this shaman Marty Dobro, who's not entirely trustworthy, and I said another great character. Again, that's the longest of them, and even the longest of the stories from these is roughly about, I would say, 50 pages or so there. So it's not a long read by any means. And the final story, which we agreed to talk about, is actually my favorite of these three. It's called The Long Sword. And this one is set roughly, I think I placed it at about 1179, when the kingdom of Jerusalem still existed, and it had been kind of divided up by these transplanted Christian lords there. And this one actually concerns one of those lords named Sir John, who is the son of some crusaders who got some land east of the Jordan, so it would have been right on the border with the Saracens. They're basically these lords who are constantly kind of fighting and trying to defend this patch of desert there. And Sir John, whose name among the Arabs is called the Long Sword, he has an extremely tiny castle called the Mount, which he defends with a handful of soldiers there, and he's obviously barely hanging on with a tiny bit of land and very little property, and there's very much a sense of kind of impending doom where it comes to him. And he gets involved. There's again some really great passages. Basically, this they get a tip about a caravan which is passing through from one of the local Arabs who, and it's clear that Sir John is a bit of a robber baron and that he has to kind of steal because steal from his enemies there, and that he doesn't have enough to support himself regularly there. And as he goes along, he finds that there's a much deeper plot. And this one actually, interestingly, although well, I won't really mention it, but one of the characters mentioned here is Renaud of Chatillon, who was actually a very famous knight during the Crusades. He's historically, he was probably a bit more of a scoundrel than he's represented in these pages there. But it's again kind of interesting to see the way that Harold Lamb was able to weave actual historical personages in with his own characters there. And again, this one is a short one, but I think it's probably my favorite one. It's again got some nice twists. So I think Harold Lamb was a really excellent plotter there, and you won't go wrong with his stories. They'll keep you guessing on occasions there. So those were my thoughts about these three stories. From here, we'll go in some slightly different directions there, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing Derek's thoughts on these stories as well there, and I'll be in correspondence with him to see what the next step of our buddy read is. But I hope you enjoyed my my insights there, and I said I really enjoyed talking about one of my favorite authors. So this has just been a really great opportunity for me. So thanks a lot, and thanks for listening.